60s, the United States, Time magazine put on their cover, "God is dead." Well, that phrase came from Nietzsche. God is dead. I can't ever say that without signing myself of the billboard, which said, "Nietzsche is dead, signed God." Nietzsche said God is dead in the 19th century, but Rahner knew that all of that talk was ridiculous. That always a religious impulse of service. It didn't surprise Rahner when I told him there was a religious revival in the United States. He expected that. It won't surprise me to hear there's a religious revival in China or Russia. It's going to happen. It's inevitable. Simply a question of time. Why? Because we human beings are essentially oriented to mystery. Because there's a religious impulse in our heart because you can't get away from it, no matter what else you might do. I said I was going to plan these lectures with plenty of time, and I feel rushed. I try now to draw the implications of point one out of all these points. I must have got carried away on that point. Implications. Well, what do I say to the young man? It's interesting. Ask yourself, what advice did you give to this guy? I want you to tell him what to say to the security guard and to his fiancée to feed him the line. Well, I tell you the truth, I took sort of what I call a dialectical approach to it. I answered some of his questions that way. I'd tell you one that I learned. In other words, there'd be some counselor that would say, "Well, that's ridiculous. I'm not telling you anything like that. Why do you defeat yourself?" But I said, I did it another way. I said, I can think of a good one that I learned. I remember when a very good friend of mine, many years ago, his father died. Long time ago now, and he told me that when people came to the funeral home, the thing he remembered most was the people who came up to him and said something positive about his father. This is a simple guy, like your dad is a good guy to work with. That seemed to mean most of them. Well, he told me that. I don't know this from any data or any other way, but that seemed like a neat thing to do. And I've always tried to do that. I suppose I preach at funerals the same way. Simply try to say something good about this person. We don't have to have any glib answers that maybe, your father is in heaven or something, or remember the resurrection. It might be nice in some cases, but it seemed like a nice thing to say. And I told this young man that. He was so worried about his fiancée's father, thought he was going to die, and what would he say to her then? And I said, that would be a nice thing to say. Well, that sort of satisfied him. I even talked to him a little bit about small talk. What that means. We all know some highly educated, brilliant people who can't make small talk, who don't know how to interact at a light level. One of my own mentors was that way, just almost incapable of talking, superficially, and shooting the breeze, as we say. But, and I tried to tell this guy how he might banter with the security guard. But after that, and which is just sort of a way of saying, hey, I know your problem. It's hard not to know what to say. Then I went to the thing that is really essential and that we get out of the whole Rahnerian thing here, and that is that ultimately there's no answer to this. You'll come to me with 50 more situations. I can't feed you lines for everything. Why? Because people are ultimately mysterious. Because we're mysterious. Because you can't program life like that. Because what we need to do as human beings is learn to be spontaneous, to trust our intuition. Now this afternoon I could not trust my intuitions. I told the guy on the phone, I said, I am so angry, I am not going to speak with you anymore. I'm not going to tell you, what I'm thinking about all of this. I did. I'm serious. Because I couldn't trust, because I was probably going to tell him to take the NCR and do something with it, And I thought, well, that's sort of stupid, because I can reach 135,000 people that way. Even if they don't publish this article, they'll publish other ones. Why should I throw away 135,000 chances to reach people? It would be sort of stupid to say. But I couldn't trust my intuition, so I said that directly. I can't, I'm not going to tell you what I'm thinking, except that I'm mighty angry. I'll tell you what I'm feeling. Anyway, come back to the notion that what we got to learn in life, I suppose, is what we can trust. And learn more of our intuitions that work positively for us and that we can go with. But we remain essentially mysterious, so I have to take the person back to trusting that. Now, one of the things that I tried to do, I said, look, let's try something, because all this time you tell me your father abused you, and you're sitting there smiling. I said, now that doesn't make sense. I said, why don't you tell me about how your father abused you, and tell it to me honestly, and let whatever is there come out. Don't pretend anything. You don't have to pretend with me. You can say it any way you want it. You can yell, scream, curse, cry, whatever you want, but tell me in an authentic way what you're feeling about the fact that your father abused you. And I told him, anytime you come to talk to me, that's rule one. You don't have to please me or make a point or do anything. You can be whoever you are. The first thing that this person has to learn is that in his search for itself, that he can trust the search. Never going to make it without that. He has to trust that whatever comes out will be all right. That he can look at all the painful elements, the shadow side, and somehow integrate that into who he is. Without that, he isn't going to make it. He has to learn to trust his own emotional reaction. Now, what he needs to do is to go to the security guard and sometimes just blurt out whatever he's thinking or feeling. And check it out, see how it works. Eventually, I think has to do something with his father, although that will be down the road. I don't know if it'll ever get to that. But what he can do is learn, in at least a few situations, to trust his reactions to given people who will treat him right or give him honest feedback and so on. Now, does that say anything to the rest of us in trying to figure out who we are? One thing it says to me is that we got to figure out what roles society has made us play. What sort of masks or facades we've had to put on in order to somehow be acceptable in our world. It's important to know that in order to have some sense of what the true self might be that we're looking for. I'm not one for total candor. I don't think that candor or frankness is the greatest virtue. I think charity is. And I don't think that you just tell everybody all the time exactly what you think and feel. I think that's foolhardy. Because some people will not treasure it. Some people will turn it against us. Some people will throw that back in our faces. Some people can't handle that. I remember somebody standing outside a church one day, and someone came up to me and they said, "Hey, cheer up, you look so sad." And my response was, "Well, that is because I am sad." And they couldn't handle that. I think they think priests are always supposed to be happy or something. Whoopee! Get out the balloon, And so somehow I was not allowed to be sad. That's funny. I remember a woman came to my mother's house one time, and she thought she had to perform. I don't even know if my mother knows this, but she thought she had to perform the whole time she was there. And of course, in my mother's house, she didn't have to perform at all. You could just see this young lady could take her shoes off or go take a nap while we were talking or do anything else, and it blew her mind. As a matter of fact, that woman was never the same after that. I kid you not. It was a conversion point in her life. Conversion point in her life that somebody allowed her to be where if she felt like napping, she could nap. In her own home, she could never do that. In her own home, she was always on display. Always had to play a role to please. Not interesting. So what is it? In other words, if this whole, what we call theological anthropology, this whole understanding of what human existence is all about, this question, who am I, first of all says negatively, let's get rid of the facade, let's get rid of the mask. At least in our own mind. I mean, sometimes you have to use those. You have to make it through the world, you know. I couldn't tell Michael today everything I was thinking about him because he would have fired me on the spot. No, there's a prudence that comes into it. But the saving point is that I know I'm playing a role then. That's the whole saving thing. I know what I'm really feeling, I know what I'd like to say, and I choose to be more prudent about it. I choose to wear a particular mask in any given situation. I choose to perform a function. We do this in liturgy all the time, in a way. Maybe one doesn't feel like getting into the creed at Mass, but one does it. One says the creed because, well, that's there to be said. In other words, you get into it, you say it because that's part of it. Maybe you'll believe it more tomorrow or something. Or maybe you'll mean more later on. Liturgy, in a way, is role play. Oh, the clergy there, the priest there, has to be up and has to be into it. That's his job. No, the priest is sad then. I mean, that's not supposed to just come across. Parents try to do that with youngsters sometimes. There's all kinds of situations, but the saving grace is we know what's going on inside of us. Positively, that's the negative side of this whole thing. Know the maps. Sometimes you have to drop them. Try to get in touch with truth. On the other side of it, it seems to me, is the whole positive effort to build up who we are, to make sure that the story we live out is appropriate. One of the questions you can ask yourself when you say, what is my story? I'm the person who, is it appropriate or not? Was it appropriate for Ronner to be a 19th century individualist in the 20th century? Could ask that question. Was it appropriate for a submissive wife to be totally passive in an age of women's liberation? Is it an appropriate role to walk around on tiptoes and not be able to say to one's spouse what you really think? Is that an appropriate thing to do in this day and age? Maybe yes, maybe no, but that's a way of asking the question, I think. How do we build up an appropriate story? How do we find an image that fits our world and fits this Christian faith that we say we believe in? Well, how do we find an image of ourselves that really fits? So, I mean, if somebody says, my image of myself is step on whoever gets in the way and get ahead and make it big in the world. That's my image of the successful life. Well, if that person is a churchgoer and reads the scriptures and goes to Mass and is a member of the Christian community, then they get challenged in that. Their story says, well, that's not an appropriate story. I have to find another story to live out. Otherwise, I'll always be out of sync. I'll never be who I'm really supposed to be. I think that I'm going to stop there. I realizing that I only did Roman numeral 1 in the thing. I think I'm going to stop and let's take a 5-minute break and come back and reassess the total situation. Talk it over and see what we should do. Let me see if we have any questions around what we've said here? Comments, films, yes? Yeah. Very good question, and it deserves more statement. In a sense, next week, in the lecture on searching for God, I will say much more about that. I on purpose left it very vague today, but the thing that to notice about the word mystery is that it plays off against the word problem. That is, I borrow this from Gabriel Marcel, 20th century existential thinker, who distinguished mystery and problem in this way. So the problem is something that is essentially solvable. You use your reason, you figure it out, take the means to achieve the end, and that's it. No, it can be any kind of thing. How to get the car started, or how to fix the house, or how to repair a relationship, or whatever. That's a problem, can be solved. Most things in life are problems like that. We had all these problem-solving techniques and measures that we learned. So the mystery, the way I'm using, is that which is essentially unsolvable. No matter how smart you were and how many people you had working on it, you wouldn't ever be able to figure it all out. Nor would you be able to exhaust it. You'd not be able to comprehend it. It would always remain larger than our minds or our collective thinking. It's that which is the word that I like, I suppose, best these days, is that it's inexhaustible. No matter how close you got to it, you'd never be able to drink it all in. It would be more than, always more than, it would always surpass. You see, what thinkers and theologians have done throughout all history is to try to find a way of speaking about whatever it is that's the goal of our life and the source of our being. I really am in danger here of getting into next week's material. I should be careful. But we've always tried to think of how to say that. Some people talk about the ultimate. Some people talk about being with a capital B. Some people talk about mystery with a capital M. And also to distinguish it out from a mystery story. Mystery story is that which is solvable. As you're going along, you're trying to read it, and you're figuring out who did it. At the end, you find out you were wrong. But it is solvable. You know, but we don't want it. That's why it'd be good to think, as you said, the capital M, as you would talk about being with a capital B. All of it is trying to point to that which we can never get hold of, which exceeds our grasp. Try to apprehend it, always exceeds it. And what I'm saying tonight is that the first place to locate that mystery is right here. I remain mysterious to myself. Our freedom remains unfathomable. You try to do it. Try to, for example, you can come at this by analyzing your freedom. Try sometimes to figure out exactly why you did a particular thing with total honesty. Well, what I would think would happen is you'll find always the motives are mixed. And almost always, I should say always you're going to find something in there negative that you're not too proud of in a way. You know, that you wonder about. And probably when you finally get down to it, you won't be able to figure out what percentage of which is which. Now, even if you just limit to the positive motives versus negative motives, it might even be hard then sometimes to figure it out. Let's say you come up with 5 motives, you try to figure out what percentage they place out. In other words, we remain mysterious to ourselves. We don't ever get to the bottom of it. And that's my point tonight is, and the reason the therapy, may well work, or if it does work, the reason is because that's a good thing. It's good in a way that we are mysterious to ourselves. It's the same thing you say about Christology and saying there's a way in which it's good that Jesus didn't appear to know everything. That, in some people's minds, that's a negative. That's a point, 2 points against Jesus. He didn't know when the end of the world was coming, for example. He didn't know who touched his soul. For some people, the reaction to that is negative, like, wow, he's imperfect. But there's another way to think of it, and that's what I'm trying to create tonight almost, is that you can think of that same thing positively. What it does is open up things for us. Life, instead of feeling like this, feels like that. Like we are sort of infinite possibilities. What does it people say? We tap only a tiny percentage of our capabilities in our lives. It's sad. So much that we could do surprises us. I learned that when I was 16 years old working in the warehouse, and I swore I couldn't pick up another bag. I swore I couldn't pick up. There's no way I could pick up another bag, but I picked up another one. Heavier than I was, but I picked up another. There's a fatigue factor that maybe you get through, and you surprise yourself. The next reflections article is very tough one to write and so on, but it's part of it is about a woman who talks about the surprising strength she's finding as she's facing death. Totally foreign. If you'd asked her how courageous she would have been and how she would have handled it, and she would have said, I'd fall apart. I'd never make it. I couldn't handle it. No way. Impossible. And she's doing it. And she can't believe it herself. It seems as though that happens so often. It's part of this sense of the positive sense that there's an openness here. That life's like this. There's potential to be tapped. There's limits too. There's a counterpoint always a dialectic at any point in Ronarian theology. There's limits. It's important to know those limits, deal with them. And tonight, the emphasis is someplace else. In the fourth lecture, maybe we'll talk more about the limits. But tonight, the emphasis is on the fact that we are mysterious is positive, neat, good. It makes life exciting. Let's find out how I'm going to turn out. Let's see if I can handle it. I tell people that sometimes, just worried about a new challenge. Isn't it sort of fun to find out if you can do it or not? There's a sort of adventuresome spirit about it. It's very good to be able to get that kind of attitude. Extended answer.
I remember Richard mentioning a lot of things, but particularly I remember for it wasn't clear how practically it was.
That problem under the heading of hubris, which we translate as pride, an overweening kind of pride. And I think maybe that's a way to get at what you're talking about. It seems to me that is the counterpoint. It almost forces me to then to talk about limitations and so on, and a proper sense of that. Obviously, one can get carried away with one's own importance. Talking to someone recently where my advice was just the opposite of this person. In other words, they think they can do anything and it's unrealistic. By any standard, it just is. If you can't make it through a rather simple undergraduate class, it's not realistic to think you're going to end up getting your PhD from that institution. I wouldn't rule it out, but it's just, there's a way in which he's probably going to be healthier to accept the fact he's probably not going to achieve that. So, I think that is part of it, and I think what we'd have to know is about ourselves. Do we sell ourselves short, or do we get carried away with our own importance and significance and potential? That's part of the wisdom of life. It's always a dialectic in this kind of theology. It's never a simple line. One way. We got this potential. It's always, but there's limitation, and that seems to be what we have to deal with. The summary phrase I use so often is that we human beings are, this mysterious combination of infinite longings and finite capabilities. And the healthy personality is going to deal well with both those statements, the infinite side and the finite side. And I think you raise a question of history. It raises a question in my mind of, in connection with honor and so on, of greatness. How one will be remembered. I did it in personal terms. I know sometimes when I give talks to corporation people who are not maybe into thinking about ultimate questions. It seems to me, I used to use a technique, I want you to think for a while how you want one of your children to speak about you after you're dead. Isn't that how I said it, Tom? How do you want to be remembered? By your children. Which is a way of personalizing this question of who I am. Now, it's a few individuals, it seems, who have sort of a broader notion of that, who live a bigger life. They're on the larger stage, and their question isn't just how their kids are going to remember, but how history will remember them. And maybe when you get caught up in that too much, you are at least in danger of toothless pride. Always a counterpoint. Let's try something for a few minutes. Some people told me last week they liked a little bit of quiet time and talking. But let's just do that for a few minutes, and then I'll give one more chance for questions, and then we're going to call it a night. You're not shooting to be here till 9:30, but I just let's try that again to prime the pump. So what I'm going to ask you to do is just take a minute or so to write down some reactions to what I said. Quiet time, and then I'm going to ask you to talk to the person next to you. It doesn't have to be any great personal sharing, but just talk for a minute about what you got out of what we were talking about, and then we'll give one more chance for questions. Let me try to raise anything with anybody. Yes?
All right. I heard you mention
supernatural existential. No.
I'm wondering, existential. That like Kierkegaard talked about, that I need to take as a thing in my way out there. Why is it?
Well, the reason, there is a connection with existential thought, because existentialism as a whole is a movement connected with people like Kierkegaard in the 19th century and Friedrich Nietzsche in the modern 20th century would be Heidegger and Sartre and Marcel. And what they had in common, in part at least, was this sense that of the individual and the development of the individual, and the fact that we do not have a fixed essence. So that our real essence is existence. That is, that we are existing people shaping our future. As Ronner likes to say it, we are those who have the capacity to make ourselves to be what we will be forever. So in that sense, yes, there's a clear connection. Existential thought is, heavily centered on freedom, the importance of the individual. Now, what Kierkegaard wanted on his tombstone, the individual. He was very upset with the culture as a whole, with Christendom, with the church, and so on. And so you find that very individualized thing. You find the celebration of freedom much more than knowledge, and you find this developmental sense in existential thought. Now, all those themes are in Ronner. Ronner was very influenced by Heidegger, although I probably said this in answer to a question once before, but I'll repeat it, and that is that Rahner always denied that influence. He never would admit that much dependence upon the existentialist thinkers, yet there are clear link-ups. Rahner's idea of death is closely tied with Heidegger's. That is what I was telling you, the boundary and the authenticity that comes. You can only be resolute and authentic when one lives in realization that I will die. No, and then with Sartre, you've got this marvelous notion that Rahner talks about, a very realistic notion, I should say, that we are condemned to be free. That's one of Sartre's notions. We're condemned to be free. And Rahner talks that same way, that freedom is a burden. You can't get away from it. In fact, a lot of 20th century activity and frenzy is precisely around that, of trying to escape from responsibility, and push it off on somebody else. And to deal, and much of our dis-ease seems to come from the fact that we got so many options. People will say that to me, it's too confusing. I could choose 15 different things. What am I supposed to do, or how am I supposed to respond? So there's a way in which that catches that since we are condemned to be free, you can't get away from it. Not to choose is to let the policy lapse, or let the house fall down, or to let the marriage go bad, or whatever. Not to choose is a type of decision. Therefore, we are condemned to be free again. Remember when Rahner talked about supernatural existential, what he was getting after is that there are patterns in human existence. There are characteristics that all human beings have. This flies in the face of, this excessive individualism that comes out of Kierkegaard and some existential thinking. Like, everybody is so totally unique you couldn't talk to one another. So there's no experience that's common. My experience is mine, yours is yours. There's no universals. There's no general principles. There's no communication at that point. I know people like that who think that way. I think they belie their thought by the fact that they still talk and expect other people to know when they say, more soup. I expect somebody to jump up and get it, However, that belies is, you do your thing, I'll do mine, and there's no universals or principles. But people who think that way or tend in that way. And what the supernatural existential reminds us is that people like Heidegger thought that isn't true. There's a lot of things that we can say about Chinese people as well as people in the United States. Not everything is culturally conditioned. One thing is that we are beings in the world. Heidegger said we are thrown into the world. We wake up and find ourselves there. We didn't say, I want to be born. We didn't say, I choose you as my mother. We had no choice. That's one of the hard things of life, is we didn't have a choice about that kind of thing. We just are thrown. We're just there someday. And our task is to make the best out of it that we can. That's one of the givens of life. Back to the other question there about pride or hubris. The essential pride is not to accept that kind of limitation. So there are patterns, it seems. One is that we are beings moving towards death. One is that we are beings in the world. One is that we are religious creatures, essentially oriented to mystery. Those are some of the, things that are true wherever you live, whatever age and whatever time. But there's clear things that it's just problems with existentialism today. I mean, it's sort of run its course. Even Sartre late in his life became a Marxist. He had to find a way to get a broader perspective. I mean, it gets so narrow that you can't deal with life anymore. You need a political, social, communal, family sort of understanding of life. And I think that that's why existentialism, in a sense, I suppose, is thought of as being bankrupt. It's run its course. I mean, undergraduate students might still like to read Camus and so on. And but as far as a philosophy that makes it in the world and so on, it clearly has its limitations. I think there's important ideas that can be retrieved from it are helpful, and we should latch on to our permanent possessions. But many thinkers at least feel like it's too narrow, too individualistic. Getting near the end, ladies and gentlemen. One final one. If you're going to be in pain the rest of the night, you get to ask it now. If not, last one. The tough questions have been saved to last. And that is, of course, a crucial question. I just affirm a lot of what you said. It seems to me that if you start looking at the world and weighing it all out, it'd be mighty easy to come to the conclusion that the mystery is not benign. Just look at films from Ethiopia these days. Think of the Holocaust. Think of a whole lot of things. In fact, I would think that the statement that the mystery is gracious is not statistically borne out. 2/3 of the people are hungry right now. Maybe you say, well, 51% were eating right, we'd say the mystery is gracious. Tilt it the other way, we'd say it's against it. So I don't think that statement is in any way a statistical statement or an empirical statement. I think that it is ultimately a statement of faith. It is clearly a faith statement. But what is interesting about that is that does not mean it's because your mother taught you what is said in the Bible or took you to church and told you that the world is good or that God is good. I don't think that's where it comes from. It comes from, in my opinion, an intuitive sense that we have that despite whatever appears to be most wrong with the world, that somehow it will be righted. And that's why I think that faith is clearly a gift. It's not added up. You don't wake up someday and say, well, there's Biafra and there's Ethiopia, but then there's the United States, God's chosen land, so God must be good. I don't think it works like that. What you do is you wake up someday, and on the worst of days, you still figure somehow you're going to get through it. Or even the days when you feel teetering on the edge, somehow you feel it still is okay. Whatever the worst of the calamities that one imagines, the worst of evil, faith means this intuitive sense that I will rise above it, or it's okay despite that. Faith is a matter of despite. Despite the absurdity of life, my faith is it has meaning. Despite my abiding sense of unworthiness, somehow I think I'm still favored or all right. Whatever it is. And then what happens, of course, is that faith wavers. Doubts come in, and some days you feel less worthy than others, and some days the absurdity of life seems to be more powerful than others. That is where belief comes in. Belief means acceptance, if you're a Christian believer, acceptance of Jesus Christ and His story, His life, death, and His resurrection. And if you're a believer, then like you go to Mass on Sunday and your faith is wavering, and that builds it up a little bit. Or you're starting to wonder if you're worth anything at all, and you read in your Bible, that Jesus loved everybody, and that bolsters you up a little bit. In other words, what happens, I think, for the average person, I'm not talking about theologians, the average person is that their belief system, their religion, the community they belong to, the worship service they go to, and so on, helps to fructify, build up, strengthen the wavering faith. At its best, it encourages that. They work together. Faith and belief have to work together, as I'm describing here. And I think, you see, Sartre said the world is absurd. Man is the useless passion. Camus, to stick with the edge of things, Camus said the same thing, myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, the guy, rolls his rock up the top of the mountain all the time only to have it fall back down, and he's got to go pick it up again, push it up there again. He's got to do that forever. And even Albert Camus, who says, life is absurd and so on, interestingly, when he writes about that myth, says Sisyphus had a smile on his face. If you can imagine. Nothing worse. All infinitely pushing the rock up only to have it fall down. Nothing could be more absurd. Not accomplishing anything, not doing anything, it's not getting any place. Camus, the atheist, the humanist, and so on, says Sisyphus has a smile on his face. He's mastered his rock. He's mastered his faith in a way. I say that those people belie their teaching by their life and action. Sartre was active in the resistance against the Nazis. Camus was a great humanist. I say that their life said they thought it had meaning. Their life was saying the mystery is gracious. Even all their words, their teachings, their books is saying it's absurd. Why did they get up in the morning? Why did they fight in the resistance? Why did they write books? I can only see it in terms of somehow there was a context of meaning. Somehow my words, the mystery was perceived as gracious. In fact, it seems to me almost everybody has that intuitive sense. Now, the one exception is the person who now is going to commit suicide. And even there, one has to wonder a lot about what is really going on in that situation. Better make a briefer answer to your last very insightful question and so on about feeling hemmed in by the limitations of life, right? If I have it right. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, one doesn't feel great potential. Wow, I'll take the world on today, man. Can't hold me down. I would say, really, to make a longer answer the full answer would take on, I think, a couple things. One is the attitude we bring towards it. It seems to me there's a reversal of attitude that just works. It's proved in the practice. That is, you go out and you think you can do well in the interview, and you set yourself that way. There's a way in which you do better. I think I'm going to make that putt. I'm going to make it more often. Now that might sound pedestrian. I believe that. That's true. It's true. The attitude you bring to the day, to the moment, to the time is crucial. If someone comes here tonight thinking I can get something out of this, they will. If someone comes here thinking that, I just put in my time to please my husband, to be here, and they block out. They don't get anything out of it. The attitude changes everything. The world looks different. Everything. I look different. Nothing else changed except the attitude. As Sartre said, again, I don't know why I'm on the existentialist, he kicked me off, but he said, we were never so free as during the resistance, during the Nazi occupation. Why? It's the attitude you bring. You can be free in prison. And then I would say the fuller answer has to be that very often the limitations that are put upon us just have to be exploded. One of the first things I always did in any new job when I was working for any new person or as a priest in a new place is carve out my freedom. Here's the limit. I don't expect you as the pastor or the principal or whoever else you are to infringe on. We're going to talk about it, but those limits are there. And they're out there. They're far enough out there so they're not going to chase me. And I'm going to have that freedom in there, and I'm going to demand it. I'm going to demand it. You know that. Get their spouse aside and say, let's talk about this, and this is what we dealt with tonight, or the groups will drive together. This is a good deal. That would solve a number of problems. Parking problems, we had carpools, and also for discussion on the way home. So I'm very hopeful that all of that will take place outside of the gathering here. I will be lecturing in somewhat briefer extent, I think. Last week we ended about 9:15. Whenever we end, people can go ahead and do it. I'm planning less input than I usually have in my lectures in the past. I think that's perhaps enough by way of preliminary remarks. Anybody got any questions about what we're doing? One other thing, these are autonomous units. They make sense on their own. If you miss one, fine. You can show up for any one of them, and I hope that they are meaningful to people. Those people who are into greater effort here can come to all of them and get a comprehensive viewpoint of the whole thing. Now, are you ready to sit down? I'm not going to start till you sit down. No. Yeah. Okay, you prefer to sit down. If you will away, you faint during this time. Anybody with a birthday on October 24th ought to know better. Okay. The topic tonight is the search for our self. And as usual, I will begin with talking about a particular case. I always despise these cases in one way or another so that people's identity is not obvious and so on. And yet what I try to draw from them is the very concrete way in which they express to me the problem, and which seems in one way or another to epitomize for me the question that we're dealing with. This is the story of a young man who comes to me and wants me to tell him what to say to his fiancée in about 6 different circumstances. He also wants me to tell him some taglines to say to the security officer at the place where he works, who he runs into periodically. Also wants me to do the same thing for a number of other situations, including one in his own family circle. He wants me to tell him what to say to his father in a number of situations. Now that's a very interesting kind of request. And so it obviously requires more investigation of, well, why do you want me to tell you those things? Well, why wouldn't you think of them yourself, what to say to the security officer? And the answer comes back, well, I don't know what to say to the security officer. It baffles me. I have no experience that way. I have nothing to draw on. I don't know what to say in almost any situation. Well, a lot of empathy begins to arise inside of me as I carry on this conversation. And so I try to go a step further and find, well, why is this? And then they says, well, I never learned anything of this at home. It turns out that I'm talking to one of these people who are commonly called an abused youngster now. So a youngster who had no interaction with siblings and no real interaction with his parents. Never learned any of the skills of how to talk or interact or have small talk or what to say in any kinds of situations. All that he ever got from his father was a great deal of criticism and saying, well, you're never going to amount to anything. You never will be any good. His father evidently thought that if he would deal with the young man that way, that the young man would shape up and make something out of his life. So I begin to look even further at this, and what one notices about the young man is all the time he's talking to me, he's smiling. He's even smiling when he's telling me about how he was abused. And so I begin to look at this as, this is out of sync. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so when I begin to ask the further question of, well, how can it be that you don't know what to say in the simplest kinds of situations, he says to me, well, I really don't know what I feel. I suggest that he tell his fiancée what he feels. He says to me, most of the time, I don't know what I feel. And the final step in looking at the whole process is it comes out, the young man says to me, I don't really know who I am. Now, here we have an example, obviously an extreme case, that sets up this search for self. Now, this young man is in a real search for self. He has no idea who he is. He usually doesn't know when he's angry or when he's sad or when he's feeling much of anything. He walks around playing a role all the time and has no idea of how to interact in any kind of a healthy way with other human beings. Now, one could dismiss this example and say, well, that's strange. I mean, that's a weird situation here. That has nothing to do with me. Let me tell you another story which perhaps highlights this. And this is a story that some people at least know. It's a story of Thomas Merton. Now, you start talking about Thomas Merton, you're talking about one of the great religious thinkers of our time, a mystic, a holy man, a Trappist monk who spent years finding out who he is, what he was all about, getting inside of himself, getting self-awareness, getting closer to God. One of the great figures of our time. Well, it so happens that Thomas Merton's abbot didn't like him very well down at Gethsemane. And he thought that Merton was sort of out of line in some way. He wanted Merton to stop writing so much, to live more the life of a monk. And so what this abbot did was set up a meeting between a leading psychiatrist and Thomas Merton in Chicago, when Merton was allowed to travel on one occasion. And so it was set up that the psychiatrist, in talking to Merton, would tell him what a weird person he was. He told Merton things like, what you ought to do, you're so hungry for fame, what you ought to do is set up your hut on Times Square and put a neon sign up on it. He told Merton that he was nothing but a publicity seeker. Told him all kinds of things like that. And the reaction was, this great mystic and holy person was totally devastated. Came undone and unglued. Couldn't handle that kind of situation. Forgot who he was. Lost his identity in a way when challenged in that fashion. Well, I tell those two stories back to back in order to set up some sense of the fragility of our own identity. I just went through this afternoon, just to personalize this a little bit. I opened up the NCR today and was just livid when I found out an article of mine that they had promised would be in the last 2 weeks was not in again this week, and since it's about the election, there's no way it can be in the paper next week either. So I went to my office and got on the phone and called the editor and proceeded to tell him how angry I was at all of this. And his response to me was more or less tough luck. Now, take it or leave. If you don't like it, tough. When I heard that, it reminded me of certain other events that I've had with publishers. I do not get along well with publishers. I have a horrible history with these people. And I've had other situations that, while not of the magnitude of Thomas Merton's, have been to me very difficult things to handle. Have been very hard things to maintain one's identity in the face of, put it that way. Just to personalize that a little more, and I think to make a point, I remember the years that I spent in Oxford, England. And when I was in Oxford, I didn't really function ministerially. I was just doing my writing. I didn't function as a priest. I mean, I didn't have regular pastoral duties or anything. And I noticed in that situation, again, how tenuous my identity was. I remember, and this sounds silly, I suppose, to anyone except someone who's gone through a similar thing, is I made it part of my regular practice in the morning when I got up as part of my prayer meditation to remind myself of who I was, very consciously and clearly, and just to play it through in my own mind. Now, again, still trying to elucidate the problem, people remember that Erik Erikson talked about the identity crisis, the one who popularized that phrase. My father's response to the identity crisis was, get them a bracelet with their name on it. He had a simple solution to that. There's others in the room who have that same solution to the identity crisis problem. Write it out for them. Give them a sign. In fact, I think many people thought that that Erikson produced the identity crisis, that no one ever had one before, so he wrote about it, and people read about it and said, I ought to have one. It's something like the midlife crisis. They write about it, now every 45-year-old male goes through one. Years ago, people sailed right through fine, but now since people have written a book about it, you have to have one to begin. Well, Erikson identifies this whole crisis that people go through, a kind of not knowing who they are. And of course, apart from the flip way of looking at it, that maybe what has happened, of course, in a complex and changing world, it becomes harder to know that. My way of saying that was, in the medieval world, no one had an identity crisis. Everyone knew where they were because you were born into a certain situation, knew who you were, and that's it. But today, it's not so easy because people are mobile, because people move around, go into different surroundings and so on, and the identity becomes harder to get a hold of, perhaps. A complex and changing world, I think, creates the crisis and not really Erikson talking about it. As soon as you get flux and flow and change and breakdown in values and so on, more and more people are going to be searching out who they are, where they fit, what they are about, what they're supposed to be doing, what is the self that they are all about. Now, just to complicate the picture just a little bit more, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but there's even a further challenge to this whole thing that comes from the world of Buddhism. So in Buddhism, they have the doctrine of anatta, or anatman, as some people say. It is the statement that the self is an illusion, that the search for self is what messes us up, that we are more fluxed and flow than that there isn't some permanent identity that we are the base of all of this. Now, as I say, I'm not going to elaborate on that unless somebody wants me to, but it is just to, again, sharpen the problem. In other words, there's a significant group of people walking around saying that even the search itself doesn't make sense. You're looking for what you'll never find because there isn't any self. And the ultimate illusion in life is to think there is, and that you're going to find it someday. If you want to get at the thing in a maybe more personal level and so on, or to begin to zero on the content of this, it has to do with the questions I ask. We might ask ourselves, what sort of image do I have of who I really am? Or what sort of story best identifies me? If somebody wanted to know who I am, and I said, well, let me tell you a story, what would I tell them in order to inform them of who I really am or who I think I am? Another way of doing it is, how would we like to be remembered? Well, suppose we were to die within the month, and we had a chance to tell people how I want to be remembered. It's another way of getting at the question of who I really think I am or who I would like to be. So there is a content to this question. Ask ourselves about the image that we have of who we are, the story that defines us, and how we would like to be remembered. I'm going to invite you to spend a minute working on that question. I invite you to we'll take a couple minutes of silence while people think about that. Maybe some of you would like to write down a little bit about the answer to that. Who do I really think I am or image myself to be? On to this, the search for self. As usual, I look at the life of Karl Rahner. He's the one who's guiding us in this spiritual quest. And he's a good guy, one of the great theologians of the 20th century, a prolific writer, a man who has given us what I would call an organic approach to theology and what Christianity is all about. One of his great strengths is that in Rahner it all hangs together. One maybe for once is able to see the whole of what the spiritual life is about. See a complete sense of what Christianity is supposed to be. That's one of the great strengths that Rahner has. Now, when one looks at the identity of Karl Rahner, his own search for self, one of the things, if you ask him, well, who are you, or what are you about, or something, one of his characteristic answers was that he was a good Jesuit, an obedient Jesuit. Well, his life, his thought was shaped by his formation in the orders. I think I said before, his brother Hugo went before him as a priest in the Jesuit order. He was very influenced by the spiritual exercises that are so much a part of the shaping of the Jesuit mind. He simply, as a Jesuit, did what he was told. That's the way he described his life. He said, well, they gave me courses to teach, and I taught them. They asked me to go lecture here, and I went and lectured. Oh, they asked him to preach sermons during Holy Week, so he preached them. He had a strong sense of identity with that order. He lived, when I was with him in Munich, he lived in a house of about, 35, 40, 50 Jesuits, I suppose. Berkman College in Munich. That's where he had his existence. He always lived with other Jesuits. He found his comradeship with them. I think he found much of his own personal identity in that way. The other thing that it seems to me that Rahner used to say about himself was, in contrast to the younger people whom he liked, he loved to associate with the younger people, but he saw them in a different way. Younger people in his house, if I'm remembering this correctly, lived in little communal groups. In other words, although there was 50 or whatever in the house, they had living units of maybe 4 or 5 Jesuits who, especially the younger ones, did this, and they would eat their own meals together at certain times and study together or whatever else it was. And Rahner never participated in that. Rahner called himself a 19th century individualist. which is very strange in terms of much of what he ended up writing. For example, Ronner, I used to celebrate the noon mass with them in their community each day. And Ronner never came to that mass. He celebrated his own mass early in the morning. Never participated in the larger circle. I almost hate to say that because it shatters a lot of people's image of Karl Rahner. But it fits in with the way he thought of himself. It's still a 19th century individual. He always talked about those young Jesuits and the younger people in general who had so much a better sense of community than he himself did. The communal sense of interacting on a face-to-face basis with other individuals, human beings. So that's an odd sort of thing about Rahner. And one thing that is puzzling in terms of much of his writing, because much of his, one of the major articles he ever wrote changed the whole liturgical practices of all the priests. Priests used to often say Mass by themselves or privately or just with a few people. And Rahner wrote an article saying that, well, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do that. He says that it doesn't make any sense to multiply masses like that. You got to have one and everybody celebrate and so on. And that literally changed the practice of the clergy throughout the world, at least the Western world, the United States, and so on. Because that simple idea that it didn't make sense to multiply masses, you ought to have fewer masses and have them be more communal experiences. So despite that writing, he himself chose this other kind of piety. That doesn't mean he wasn't a member of the group, but he was tightly bound in with the Jesuit order and had a communal sense, but not so much of that smaller group kind of sense that has become so important to us today with sensitivity groups and T groups and COs and all of that kind of thing, which has become sort of a wellspring of spirituality for so many people. Rahner understood that world, but chose really not to partake of it a whole lot. Although I think, as I've said before, I was with him on Holy Thursday when he did celebrate in a beautiful way with the whole community. It seemed to him a proper day to do that, I guess. The other thing is, Rahner, I once asked him, sort of about his own sense of place in history and so on. And he said to me, I don't think that it amounts to that much. It wasn't that big a deal. He says all the great theologians had a way of identifying themselves. There was a tag you could put on them, a simple idea that went with their ideas, like Luther, justification through faith. Where there would be some central idea that would hold things together. And he says, well, he didn't see that for himself, and sort of didn't think, therefore, of himself as being this great theologian the way other people ended up seeing. He had this great humility. To repeat a story again, one time I borrowed a book of his own book, and I returned it to him when he was with the other group of Jesuits that we were having coffee and dessert that we did every day. And Rahner quickly took the book and hid it so no one would see that he had been giving me one of his own books, and was genuinely embarrassed when someone asked to see it. He was like an old shoe around his place. He was never the center of attention, and he never dominated the theological discussion, although he was, twice as brilliant and learned as anybody else in the discussion. So I think he would think of himself again as very ordinary, despite the stature and status that he did have in the world. So, Rahner, his own sense of self. I don't know exactly how that helps us, or it does maybe help to locate him in some way. But I suppose it really is his teaching that enables me to figure out how to respond to this young man who wants me to tell him what to say to the security guard. It's just Rahner's teachings that he'll probably be remembered for. His life is not that exceptional. And I'm really going to talk about two things, I believe, depending on the time, two ideas he had in answer to the question, who are we? Or what are we all about? And the first thing is to say that we humans are positively oriented to mystery. That we are mysterious to ourselves. The famous quote from Rahner is, ask the question, who is man, to return to certain sexist language, and Rahner's response is, man is the question for whom there is no answer. Come to my room, you'll see a beautiful thing that someone did for me that says that very quote. Man is the question for whom there is no answer. That captures the essence for Rahner of the whole matter. It sounds sort of negative to people, but we'll have to play it out and to come to a deeper appreciation perhaps of the significance of that statement. We remain mysterious to ourselves. We are, as we saw last week, the eternal questers. We're always searching out, wanting more, never satisfied with any of the limits that we end up meeting. We are positively oriented to mystery. That is, that there is an orientation inside of us, an innate drive for something more. Rahner analyzed that throughout most of his life in terms of knowledge. He did his doctoral dissertation on that question about human knowing. And his human knowing analysis ended up saying that we quest for knowledge and for more knowledge than we'll ever be able to attain. And that all of our life we're trying to fit the pieces together, to get a deeper understanding, to know more comprehensively what the world is all about, to extend our knowledge, to get an organic picture of what it's all about, and yet we never succeed in doing that. But probably later in his life, Rahner did a better job of this and began to speak about this quest, this orientation to mystery, as being located especially in our personal relationships. That is where we would find it most clearly. I often talk about it in terms of the search for the perfect lover, for the ideal respondent, the person who will share all of our joys and hold us when we're sad and take away all of the misery and celebrate with us when everything is going well. The person that can satisfy the deepest longings of the heart. And Rahner says the mysterious dimension of life appears when we are always frustrated in that search, when everybody ends up disappointing us, when any individual person falls short of what we would like them to be, when the other person just isn't there when we would like them to be, just not able to handle the whole thing. So that Rahner says if you analyze the love drive, it will end up in a perception of mystery. And when he talks about mystery in that context, it's that which is unattainable, which is incomprehensible, or inexhaustible, always beyond us. Whatever it is that we're searching for, we can never get a hold of. And that's what makes us mysterious to ourselves. It comes out in all kinds of ways. I mean, a lot of times people will mess up in their life, do something wrong, commit a sin, and the response is, I can hardly believe I did that. I don't believe I acted like that. That wasn't me. I mean, I'm not like that. I'm not that kind of person. And yet, pressed to the wall, I have to end up saying, yeah, I did that. And I don't understand why. I don't know what that's all about. I don't know what drove me to that. I don't understand what compulsion was behind that weird behavior. We remain mysterious to ourselves, unable to sort of grasp hold of all that we are. Rahner had a great sense, I think, borrowed from the existentialists, and I'm still in this main question here. We are positively oriented to mystery. We have a drive for that. We're not just sitting around waiting for the mystery to take us over, but we're questing, searching, looking out, going out for more experience, more knowledge, more love. We're probing our world. Maybe we're not doing it in some tremendous fashion or with great flair or elan, but we're doing it in our own private, quiet kinds of ways, seeking out, searching, the infinite searcher. Now, in doing that, what Ronner saw clearly is that we're never completed. Part of our mysteriousness is that we never arrive. So we don't, Ronner is big on saying, we don't have a fixed essence, something we can get hold of and say, yeah, that's me. It's much more mysterious than that because we're always looking for that, trying to find out who we are. That's what's, I think, right about Erickson's identity crisis. We are indeed the people who are always trying to sharpen that awareness, to become a better person, to have it in better perspective. The thing, I don't know why I say this, except it's part of his teaching, and it's so obtuse. This is a tagline that goes with Ronner all the time, that people who say that no one can understand him. That is, he talks about the supernatural existential, and almost no one understands what that means, and it's an odd phrase. But it does, I can tell you some things about it. It's Ronner's way of saying that we don't have a fixed essence. As a matter of fact, he picked that up from his own teacher, Martin Heidegger, great existentialist thinker of the 20th century. Ronner used to go to his seminars. And Heidegger said that we were composed not of a fixed nature, and then we acted in our world like that, but that we could see that there were characteristics about ourselves, general patterns that were true about ourselves, and he called those existential. Like one of the great existentials for Heidegger was that we are beings moving towards death. That's what all of us are. And we could never be authentic people until we can say, sort of openly and with calmness of spirit, I will die. Not other people will die, or people die, but I will die. And that was Heidegger's way of saying the only way one could reach authenticity in life was to be able to say that with a certain calmness of spirit. That, in Heidegger's mind, is an existential. Well, what Ronner said is that there is an existential that's even more important than that one. And that is what he called the supernatural existential. That is that the deepest orientation we have is towards this mystery. And here's the place to bring in a characteristic of the mystery. It's not just oriented to any kind of mystery, a mystery maybe that's like a ghost ready to scare us, or a mystery that is just far away and doesn't care about us, or a mystery that's like a great joker that's making life hard for us, or a mystery that tempts us in ways we could never understand. Ronner's phrase for the mystery is that it's a holy mystery. H-O-L-Y. It's a holy mystery, sacred mystery. My translation of that, or way of saying it, is that the mystery is gracious, benign, friendly, kindly. And that's really what sets off this positive orientation. That's why we think we can trust it. That's why we call the gospel good news. That's the best news we can think of. That's the key, deep down, rock bottom, good news. That the mystery that's in charge of our lives is gracious, kind, friendly, on our side, with us. There isn't any better news than that. That's the secret, it seems to me, to mental health. That's the secret to making progress in life. That's the secret to the young man, eventually, as I'm going to try to tell you, in getting his own life together, in figuring out what to say to the security guard. We're positively oriented to gracious mystery. Whatever it is that's in charge, we don't control it, but we can trust it. Whatever it is that's running this world is friendly, Whatever power is around, it's on our side. That's what Jesus Christ taught us in saying you could call the mystery Abba, Papa. That's the way of saying what the gospel is all about. Now, Ronner used this fundamental notion. My theory is that he knew that somehow from his mother. Knew it in his family setting. Had that essential trust of life somehow bred into his bones. Knew it even before he started writing his doctoral dissertation or did any of his philosophical work. Had that innate sense that the mystery could be trusted in life, that we were oriented towards it. But then once he had it, he played that out in all kinds of different ways in dialogue with various people. The quote that I have on your paper is a result of a book called On Prayer. It's talks he gave right after the Second World War, when Germany was destroyed and falling apart. I think he gave the talks in Munich, if my memory serving me correctly, in around 46 or so. And he was responding to the malaise of the time. The questing spirit, what's it all about? Where did we go wrong? How could we have followed Hitler? How could the Holocaust have happened? And so on. And one of the things that Ronner did in this was enter into dialogue with Sigmund Freud. People remember Sigmund Freud from the turn of the century, the one who taught us about the unconscious. Now many people, when they hear Freud, they think, well, Freud is anti-religious. He wrote a book called The Future of an Illusion. Said that all religion is an illusion. So you would think that when Ronner would start talking about Freud, he'd have to say things like, well, Freud is bad, or he's crazy, or he doesn't know what he's talking about, or be careful of him, beware of him. But he didn't do that. As usual, what Ronner did was find out the deeper meaning of what these great thinkers were saying. How they could feed into his own perception that what we are is really the essentially mysterious creatures. And what he did, of course, was say that Freud uncovered for us a very mysterious realm known as the unconscious. That Freud, when he had to talk about the unconscious, went back to Greek mythology, to myths, in order to get a hold of it. And so he talked about the Oedipal complex, remembering Oedipus Rex. Oh, the so unfortunate fellow ends up marrying his mother. A tragic figure. So, you see what I'm saying is that when Ronner enters into dialogue with Freud, instead of responding negatively, he picks up out of the positive orientation that he has in our understanding of mystery. He says, yeah, Freud helps us to see that. All this talk of the unconscious, where these urges we don't understand, these impulses that are beyond us. It is a boiling cauldron in a way, as Freud described it, but it's also, as many moderns are saying, it's almost a seat of wisdom. Well, many people who follow Carl Jung and write in the area of theology these days insist on the importance of our dreams as a way of getting in touch with the deeper world, the mysterious world. You know, in the Bible, people often thought that God was speaking to them through dreams. Took their dreams very seriously. Freud, in a modern way, picked up on that biblical idea and said, well, let's take the dreams seriously because they're speaking to us of a vast reality that it's hard to get a hold of. Well, I know people who have made tremendous advances in the spiritual life by taking their dreams seriously, who have found out what's bothering them, what the obstacles are in life, and have been able to grow and develop out of their dream analysis. I'm picking up other figures here who Ronner dialogued with. He dialogued with the Marxists as well. Again, the usual thing would be to say, well, Marxism is just something bad and materialistic and far away from any notion that would fit into mystery. The mystery language would mean nothing to them. They wouldn't like it. Again, Rahner picked up positively on that dialogue and said, well, the Marxists are good in one way because they center us on the future. Because they remind us that we have to build a future. Well, they force us to think about social justice and how we're going to create a more just society. But he says as soon as you start thinking about that, you end up realizing that the Marxists have made a horrible mistake. Because they think that you can produce a certain sort of society. You can produce a class of society through a series of 5-year plans and so on. And Rahner says that's where they've made their mistake. What they failed to see is the mysterious character of human beings. Failed to see the mysterious character of history. They had forgotten that the future is essentially unknowable. And so Rahner, out of that whole framework, began talking about God in a new way. Came up with a new image of God, and he called God the absolute future. He spoke about a God who's out front of us, who's alluring us forward. Not a God up above, or even a God down below, not even a God within, as many of us talk about, but a God who's always in front of us, beckoning us, alluring us into a better future, asking us to help create this better world. God is the absolute future. He has promised and guaranteed that we will find a fulfillment for the questing heart. Well, we are the question for whom there is no answer as we walk the path of this life. The answer, the response comes only for Rahner in the afterlife. And to play that out, since Rahner's thought is so organic, one of the things he insists on, that even in the afterlife, we will not comprehend God. Rahner has a sense in which even in heaven, we will continue to quest and to grow and develop. A very interesting notion of heaven, instead of thinking of a place where you get to and get eternal rest and sit in your rocking chair and for thousands and thousands of years, wondering what are you going to do tomorrow, what's exciting going on. Rahner's idea is much more developmental than that. Much more of a sense of heaven as a state in which we're called to continual growth that would never end. So essentially, we remain the question. There is a response that comes to us, but not a way in which we comprehend it even in heaven. Well, I think a lot of people find that more exciting. People are very fatigued right now, very worn out from teaching hard all day, maybe would like to think of heaven as eternal rest. However, and that's a good image and tells us something, but there's a more biblical way of speaking about heaven as eternal life, development and growth. I think something that Rahner would lead us toward. One other, the famous 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, made the famous statement that wherever you cannot speak clearly, you must remain silent. Wittgenstein's followers, who incidentally dominated Oxford when I was there, had no room for the whole notion of mystery. I was an isolated soul in that environment. When I was talking about the eclipse of mystery and mystagogy, immersing a sense of mystery, I was like a lone voice in this academic community. For them, the thought of Wittgenstein dominated. Best thing you could do is shut up. That whereof you cannot speak clearly, empirically, quantitatively, be quiet. The rest of it is nothing but, is their favorite phrase I heard so often over there, it's nothing but nonsense to talk about. Rahner's response to Wittgenstein was something like this: interesting that he has violated his own rule. It's a same reaction to atheists in a way. Atheists got to work too hard at it in a way. Atheists always have to define themselves over against. They can't just be. They can't just be. It seems like they have to always be against. They're against atheism. They're against theism. It's hard to have a more positive program given our cultural baggage and so on. They have to fight. John Paul Sartre said that. Being an atheist was a lifelong battle. You had to fight every day because theism, belief in God, might creep back in. Why? Rahner says the supernatural existential, because we are